Hello, my name is Dr. Kwasu David Tembo. I am convener and creator of English 336, Reading and Seeing Sound, my half module on the interrelated relationship between music and sound, or music and literature more specifically. And we've been covering a variety of different areas related to how it is that music as a semiological system and as a surface and register of potential expression of a variety of states, psycho-emotional, cultural, political, economic, and so on, is very much worthy of its own sort of pedagogical attention. And it's very interesting to bring music into this sort of seminar space. And today I'm really joined by somebody who's one of my favorite people in the world, a very close friend, collaborator, former bandmate, and just a consummate and honest artist in his own right. Marc C, who is a art director and a composer. So thanks for taking the time, Marc. How you doing? And yeah, how's life?
Good. Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me on the call.
Dude, amazing. Yeah, so I'm thinking of so many different ways we could approach this particular dialogue. Recently, we looked at music in relation to cinema. Specifically this idea of music as a diffuser, but I might save that for, later in the conversation. I have basically three general questions around which to orient, our discussion. So I'll just take them one at a time and you could just respond to them as you wish. And we can pursue these lines of flight as they develop. So the first question is just what's your experience with music in general, both listening to it and playing it?
Sure, yeah. Well, I'll start with a bit of biographical stuff a little bit, I suppose. Yeah. I've been working as a composer for about 15 years, or maybe 14 years. And I've been mostly composing I got to start working with a mutual friend and collaborator of ours, Denver Jackson. He founded a company called Cloudrise Pictures in Canada here, and he'd been doing animation. So that kickstarted my, starting scoring short films. And then I started moving on to other animations and making a niche for myself, doing scores for animated features, TV shows, mostly Canadian stuff, but now I've been branching out into doing stuff in the US and in Japan. And now more recently, I'm doing video game soundtracks as well. Shortly after I started the composing, I also started a project called R23X, where I sampled video game and other sort of like vaporwave inspired, like retro futurist kind of experimental beat making. And that was over 10 years ago that I started that, and sort of on the swan song of SoundCloud beat making days. So and that
what year was that around?
That was 2014-ish,
right.
2013, 2014-ish. And about 10 years ago now, I've been had that project on the go, and that's been like a lot of ways for me to sample, digest, and repurpose the more traditional film scoring and video game scoring stuff. So so, and also produce records. And you said I'm an art director. I also produce video game soundtracks for game studios and other composers, and do vinyl, cassette, and CD stuff like that. So I won't draw that out too long. I'll reveal more information as it comes up relevant to questions, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, that's so amazing, and such a rich panoply of ways of like engaging in music. Obviously my students wouldn't know, but I met Marc in 2006, was it? Wow. We were both studying at Camosun College in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. And immediately we just sort of fell into a discussion about all this sort of pop cultural things that acted as, I think, very, identitarian and psycho-emotional lodestars that we followed, and really sort of represented like a not small portion of our dreams, or not to sound sentimental, but what it was that our imaginations were sort of papered with almost similar wallpapers, or certainly related wallpapers. And I know that we both played guitar, but you also play saxophone. So I'm interested maybe in perhaps unspooling maybe two things. First, for those who don't know, what is vaporwave, and what do you like about it? Or what did you like about it? And how's that relationship sort of changed? And maybe obliquely related to that question, How does that sort of culmination in so many ways of your listenership throughout your sort of teens and adulthood and your playership? I mean, both guitar and sax.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are good questions. One just as an aside for the vaporwave thing is it's like it's definitely gained some momentum as a term on the internet, but it what I view it as is a subgenre of electronic music that is a sample-based or plunderphonic, you can call it, genre, and it is like one step in a long lineage of like what I like to kind of call as like Tumblr music. Like there's been micro genres that have a very rich visual aesthetic tied to them. In the case of, you know, where like vaporwave sits in this sort of this timeline. You hear a lot of terms like vaporwave, chill wave, witch house, sea punk, and it's like, okay, like what, and all of it is sort of tied to me with, you know, a visual retro aesthetic and also the kind of punk ethos of like anyone can do it. Everyone's a bedroom producer. You have no idea who made this. Right. If it has samples or if it's made as an original composition, you don't have any idea. And it kind of harkens back to its source material in that sense of like early internet of like anybody can wake up and be a bedroom producer and be like, you know, have a million plays on SoundCloud, and it could be a 13-year-old kid or it could be a 40-year-old guy. And
so
you just have no idea.
Is so key in that.
And anonymity and like just this sort of like, more of like a holistic approach to music in the sense of like this is a concept album, but not so like it's a concept album that like is not for money or no producer asked you to make it. You just kind of did it. Like you're like, this is like some examples are like maybe we can add notes for like some of like my music and other things like I'm having
totally there'll be there'll be links associated for sure, but I figured just to sort of orient
that was what I was doing at that time. And you know, like I was like recording music onto a VHS tape and then using the tracking analog knob to like make it gnarled and lo-fi, and then recording that back with a high quality analog to digital converter and like mastering it there and being like, this song was made using like PlayStation 1, Game Boy, some video game sound effects samples, recorded on a VHS tape. So like there was this whole sort of process that was almost to, you know, like just a workflow that was like honoring retro technology that kind of that helped me make a name for that because of the authenticity of how it was made, instead of just slapping a filter on it to make it sound lo-fi or something like that I downloaded, you know. And then the other cool. What was the other question? Sorry.
I mean, I was talking a lot about
so like I definitely do sample-based production, and I also do like micro sampling, but I also do original compositions for films and stuff. And I started off playing saxophone in like grade 5 or something like that. Alto and soprano saxophone, and you know, it's other than that though, like after high school, I played it until grade 12, and then I took a little bit of music theory in university, but my major was visual arts, and fortunately the visual arts program I was in was very focused on larger art projects. So like it wasn't restricted to painting. It was like very much like, oh, like performance art, multimedia, installation, these kind of things. So like it helped, music could be a part of that. And it was definitely fostered sort of like a desire in me to like create multimedia stuff, but didn't necessarily teach me any hard theory. So like I'm also here, a huge message for me that I always tell everyone is like, you can write music for a symphony and not know how to write music. Like anybody can make music if they know what they like. What's more important than, and they can't teach you, what's more important than music theory is just like knowing what rips, you know? Like if you're like, I love this soundtrack and this, and I want to combine it, and this is what that would sound like, and you can recreate that. I don't care how you recreate it. If you're just sampling those two things and mashing them up, you're a composer, you know? And like, I still do play saxophone. It's the only thing I can sight read on. I actually have an electronic saxophone that I got like a month ago.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, so like I can play.
It looks like something out of Dune. It's fantastic.
yeah, I can play like a cello or something. Like it's just a different way for me to write. Using MIDI, I can play a cello with the saxophone key structure. So it's like, it's just, yeah. So that's sort of my history, is that I'm like half taught, half self-taught. Like yeah, a lot of it's by ear. A lot of, in the industry, you're kind of forced to learn it if you're having players play your music. But again, it was an afterthought. So yeah.
I mean, I love so many things about this kind of pedigree, if you will, or this genealogy of the sound, and it's working your way through a particular sensibility, which is so multimodal and so intersectional insofar as how much what you saw influenced what you heard, influenced what you played. And this kind of interesting, you know, when you say flow, there's this kind of sort of interconnected a delta of tributaries, kind of like, you know, filling in and flowing out of this kind of sea of creativity that I know you've carried such deep reservoirs of basically since I've known you. And it's really, really amazing to kind of hear it. Just, you know, I've never taken it for granted because I know you're a genius, but it's really interesting to sort of see it laid out genealogically like that, because a not small portion of it is sort of this ethos that I try and sort of promulgate to my students, that, you know, ambiguity is not something to be scoffed at or frightened of. In so many ways, ambiguity is such a productive propellant if approached in this way, where in which your voice, as you say, if you know what you like, and you have the courage, I suppose, and the experience and the exposure to really sort of hone that and figure that out, then all these other sort of tools, all these other keys, scales, theories, concepts, predicates, means of recording, means of distribution, etc., can serve a very honest expression of self. As much as poetry or literature can, or cinema can. But I think this dovetails into my next question, because you mentioned so many things, you know, specifically when I think of Vaporwave, I think of Vangelis, I think of Blade Runner, and I think about the 1980s, and I think about, you know, the association of like a particular sound that in so many ways is a synecdoche of an entire decade. That sound in and of itself can be such an identitarian force when it comes to moving images, or even just pop cultural IPs. We talk a lot about Foley. We talk a lot about sort of soundtracks. I talk about Star Wars and this idea of like you know, the sort of Doppler recordings of the two constituent elements that make the lightsaber sound, and this kind of schizophrenia where you kind of listen to your sonic ecology and hear things that are sort of impossible but are there, and require a particular kind of sensitivity to arrange them in a way that then becomes associated with like an object, like a laser sword. You could read that 1,000 times in Buck Rogers and be like, all right, you know, it's a dime a dozen. And then you watch Star Wars and you hear the sound, this roar, this growl, this sort of like this whoosh, and you're like, whoa, it becomes so identitarily specific. So I'm thinking out of that, you know, we talk about, I show a clip from Cowboy Bebop, Knocking on Heaven's Door, where Spike is in the marketplace. And Shinichiro Watanabe is saying that he wanted bebop to be sort of its own genre, but in order for it to be its own genre, it had to be fundamentally ambiguous, meaning that it pulls from so many others. And this kind of mix mash, this kind of remix, this kind of schizophrenia is such an interesting manifestation of the fact that when you're watching it, it is already an ambiguous experience of audio and visual. So with all that as a sort of preamble, just like, what do you think, what are your feelings about music in film or music associated with moving images? Because I've said to my students, maybe a bit controversially, to try and, you know, provoke them a bit, to say you can have a good score can make a bad film mediocre, and a good score can make a mediocre film great. I'm thinking of Elevator to the Gallows, where Miles Davis recorded the soundtrack kind of spontaneously. The film in and of itself is quite average, in my opinion, specifically at that time in the late 50s. But the fact that Davis did what he did and brought his brio and his particular improvisational skills, his kind of negative capability in the Keatsian sense, like it just elevated that material. It escalated, no pun, into something quite special and quite powerful. So what are your thoughts on all that?
You know,
it's a lot. I know.
Well, no, I'll just talk about what I know. And like, I mean, like, yeah, even hearing you just say that, I'm like, I feel a pang of stress, because there is a lot of pressure on a composer. Like, a lot of people say that you, as a composer, you get the final edit of the movie, basically.
Sure.
And it's like, that's how powerful it is of a tweak of the whole entire
right
of the project, right? And it's like, and of course you can make music and the director can say no, but ultimately you are getting a final pass at the emotional, the everything of the film. I will, I mean, yeah, I think it's important, but I also think it's subjective, and to some degree, like you're talking about ambiguity. I personally love that. I like subdued, like weirdness, something that doesn't actually like. I mean, I don't end up getting to do that very often because a lot of people want to, as creators, directors, whatever, want to manipulate the audience to feel a certain way during a certain
and have
scene,
a specific idea of how that should be.
Yeah. And that's and Hollywood and the resources there have often sort of created an exption of like almost like John Williams Spielbergian leitmotif. Everything is Hans Zimmer. Everything has like a sort of a cue to it that evokes a certain way of thinking, and then it spreads virally. It really does. Like thinking of what was that trailer that was so Inception trailer. We're still dealing with like the fallout of that style of trailer,
I talk very critically of Zimmer in the space.
My personal, one of my top 5 composers is Eric Serra, who did The Fifth Element. He did GoldenEye. He's a
lot of Besson work as well.
Luc Besson's like go-to for many years, and
I think from Subway all the way through to Valerian even.
Oh, I don't think he did Valerian.
Oh, did he?
No,
did
I
he
wish
do?
He did.
Anyway, he did Fifth Element, and that's a great.
Exactly. And he did The Fifth Element. Like for him, I mean, I can't speak to his process, but to me, like I know he plays the bass, and I know he used a lot of romplers, which is like a sort of a 80s 90s era, like you'd have a stack. It's like the precursor to computer synths and plugins so you'd have like a stack. You'd buy a stack at great expense of rack mounted gear, and they would be like the top of the line synthesizers of like orchestra or world music, and like, but it was sampled synth. So it was like, but it was low quality by today's standards, but it has a very recognizable sound of synth orchestra, synth live instruments, right? Like synthesized live instruments. So he used a lot of those in his like sort of his repertoire of music. Like sounds was very like iconic. Like there's this one sound that's like this bunker kind of sound, and it's a down sampled tambourine or something, and it's from Emu Proteus Orchestra SFX library, and they're easy to download now. You can buy them for $20 through Roland or something, or you can just torrent them or something. They're very easy to come by, but at that time they were top of the line. And he was like, so like a lot of his soundtracks are like he's ripping on the bass, and then he's just like I can picture him in his studio in the 90s, like leaning over to like these romplers and playing stuff. And there's this one scene in GoldenEye with Pierce Brosnan riding a tank through St. Petersburg. It's a famous scene where he's like, and in the finished edit of the movie, it's just the classic licensed MGM James Bond original thing with the guitar and the 60s kind of orchestra, like ding 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 ding, and it's like it works, But if you actually listen to the OST release, there's a tank chase track that he made that got rejected and was not used, and he actually sampled that track, and it's like there's like built-in like record scratch from these Rompler samplers in there with like synth strings, and he's literally like sampling like on an MPC, the original James Bond. It's like ding, 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 and it's like it sounds like very of its time of the 90s, and it's like, but it rips. It also has that Fifth Element. It sounds like it could be from the Fifth Element. Honestly, it doesn't really fit. I'm not even sure if he saw the scene, to be honest. So like that's like like I can't speak for him, but it's like that's an example to me of like, oh dude, that's it. I haven't gone so far as actually putting it in a timeline in Premiere and like watching the scene.
To actually map it. Yeah,
I should do that. Maybe someone else has done that on YouTube, but that
maybe one of my students could do it as a project.
Ooh, that'd be awesome. And I mean, a lot of people do like rescoring projects and stuff, but it's unfortunately, it's like the keystone of the experience of the movie, whether we want it to be or not. Like,
Sure.
And I sound jaded and cynical about it, but it's like it can really obviously change the tone, right? Like you can put
It really can.
But like it's sorry to go off on the tangent about the
No,
GoldenEye, but like
that's I like that, because it really does get to the heart of the thing. Like, for example, I try and say this to my students as well, that it's not just this idea of a sort of closed loop between the director or producers and the composer. There's so many interests, there's so many pressures that have to be sort of negotiated with, insofar as, you know, considering a demographic, a market, et cetera, and so forth. And obviously, I mean, if you look at Bollywood, for example, a not small portion of what moving images are in terms of their consumption is the potential to sort of extend that experience of consumption sonically. So you don't really have like a good movie or a hit movie if you don't have a hit score. Like, those two things are commensurate with one another in such a way that it leaves very little space for ambiguity between the two. Like, they have to be sort of so cemented in their elision, which on the one hand might, we talk a lot about, like, I mentioned Kuleshov and Eisenstein and Soviet montage and sort of Russian formalism, where in which, like, if you look at the cue sheet that Eisenstein develops, you have on the top band like the actual like frames, like just like the actual the film, and then beneath that you have like bar meters, musical bar meters, and then you have like musical score. So even and then you have like what amounts to basically concept art or sort of like doodles beneath that, and then beneath that you have this sort of, it almost looks like an encephalograph of the sort of of the contours of sort of rising tension, falling tension, et cetera, and so forth. But even if you look at that stack, the hierarchy is quite clear. It's the moving image which is buttressed, and in some ways founded on sort of its musical notation or musical sensibility, that it's the music that kind of determines pace, determines measure, determines shock, determines immersion, determines surprise, et cetera, and so forth. So this idea of the montage, even when he describes it, the four principles of Russian formalist montage, use such musical language that the two are so inextricable from one another, which really puts a real pressure, as you could say. I mean, I didn't really consider it. A high degree of pressure to basically either stick somebody's landing or kind of stick the landing in the music in and of itself, whether or not it's used or no. So, I mean, what are some of your favorite? What are some of your favorite musical scores for films, and why do you like them? What are they doing well in your opinion?
Oh, that's a tough question. I hadn't really thought about that in advance of this at all. But something that I've like lately been oddly, like, things that I return to listen to soundtracks, like, two examples of something. This isn't like, I wouldn't do this week. I've done it like the past year or two, but there's a scene in actually, because the reason I did it was I was doing a DJ set of film and anime music for a theater. And
what was that, in Vancouver?
Yeah. And it was like a Satoshi Kon retrospective, and I did like some soundtrack stuff from anime and film, and I tried to find stuff that was like I guess like stuff that sticks out to me. Like, I love all kinds of soundtracks. I love orchestrated stuff. I love Joe Hisaishi, stuff like that, you know, all the Ghibli music, and as I mentioned, Eric Serra. But something for some reason recently, in the past couple of years, that has really stuck out to me is in the movie Tenet. I still don't understand what the movie's about. It's like it goes forward and then backward. Anyways, it's so confusing. I've watched it like 10 times trying to figure out what happened, but I really like the soundtrack, and I really like Robert Pattinson. He's so cool.
Sure.
Anyways, like, but there's this scene when they're going down, they're riding in a fire truck or something, and they're going to go, I don't know if you've seen the movie, they're going to like pincer move the car or something. But there's like, it's like Ludwig Göransson, he it's like kind of like a club freaking banger. Like, it's like I like music that has club adjacent synth and tempo and strangeness in it that isn't necessarily in the rest of the movie. And another example of that is in, I don't actually even remember who did this score, shame to say, Dredd. Judge Dredd
I know
movie
exactly
like
what you mean. I don't know who did the score either. It's kind of Junkie XL. It's really interesting that they get sometimes club people to do, or people who are associated with dance music, especially for action movies. Maybe it's because of that pace and the propulsion, that kind of pulse. But we'll put it in the notes.
I'll try. I'll link to both these tracks, but there was like
Sure.
there was a track where like in that one I put it in the DJ set because it was very loopable, very like sampleable, and it was like yeah, it's like near the end of the movie when he's like, you know, he's been shot a couple times or something, spoilers, but like it's not looking good for Carl Urban's chin or whatever, and like and he's there and he's like covered in blood and he's like leaning against like a pillar and it's just like freaking club banger in the background, like kind of like ducking in and out for the dialogue and stuff. And I just thought it was like, it didn't seem super tied to the visuals in a way. Like it may have just been placed on a timeline, I'm not sure, but it had a very like, it added to the immediacy of it for me. And like yeah, I think ultimately what is often a successful thing with music is a juxtaposition. I think a lot of people have said that historically. It's just like, you know, like, sure, music that's emotional, orchestral, and really backs up what's going on screen in that sort of John Williams Spielbergian way is great and it always works. But if you have something that's a juxtaposition that you didn't really see coming and maybe doesn't even fit in any like sort of way that has a precedent that we would think of, is like, that's hard to achieve, but when it works, it works. And I think it's subjective a lot of the time, but yeah, so those are examples, a couple of weird examples of like little parts of soundtracks that I just really, really liked. And
I think that's really interesting. Yeah. I really like, I like the tension that juxtaposition, when done right, can induce. For example, you look at this trend in specifically coming off the back of what you're saying in terms of this kind of resonance or echo of Zimmer-esque kind of sonic, you know, sensibilities. For me, I've said this, and for some people it feels controversial, that I think he's kind of been phoning it in since Sherlock, because I thought that his work on Sherlock Holmes was like, it felt so different from say The Dark Knight, you know, which relied on sort of like a glissando, you know, he put like a razor blade on a piano string or whatever, you know, to sort of, you know, this idea of specifically using the music intentionally for the purposes of tension. Whereas with Sherlock, it felt so acculturated in the sense that there was a lot of Roma and Eastern European themes brought to bear. There's lots of fiddle. There's lots of, you know, natural sort of skin drums and so on and so forth. It felt more exploratory. And it felt, I think, for those people who had a particular image of Sherlock in their minds, what Robert Downey Jr. was doing in conjunction with Jude Law's Watson, which seemed pretty left, it conjoined with the music to sort of maybe allow its ambiguity from, I guess, existing source material to sort of like really find its own voice and its own niche. Like the music was as weird as the take, which worked in sort of in giving it weight and buttressing it and sort of grounding it in its own voice. Sure. And that's what I really liked about Cowboy Bebop, when we could talk about Cowboy Bebop for days. Just the music, you know, and Kano. But it's that one scene specifically in Knocking on Heaven's Door, where Spike is just, what I like about it, as I said to my students, is that you can use, you know, the score to kind of compress or distend time. Obviously, you know, the montage in and of itself has become quintessentialized with like the acquisition of skills, a training montage and so on, where you collapse that time, and the music in so many ways shows the motivation, the inspiration, the heartbreak, the ardor, the success, the victory, and so on and so forth of that process of acquisition. Whereas in Cowboy Bebop, you have kind of none of that, because Spike fails. He doesn't find his mark first. Second, he's just wandering around talking to people in this distant future that seems so near to us by virtue of the fact that you hear this sort of like this sort of Bedouin Arabic being sung over just like a very, very quiet piano, the beautiful jazz chords and so on. Nothing too rich in terms of actual complexity of the chords and what have you. But it's just, it's somewhere between a lullaby and a dirge. And it's just, it's just him alone. You get a real sense of Spike as a character without dialogue. Visual storytelling so supported by the music that in and of itself is so different from the images that you see. And that juxtaposition, it's just that scene hits me really heavy. It's about a minute long, and I think it does so much for Spike's characterization, more than any dialogue could, more than his no spoilers, his farewell, you know, dialogue about his eye with Faye in the actual original series in episode 26 and so on. Like nothing, in my opinion, that Spike ever says or does advances his character more than that one montage.
Wow. Yeah, I mean,
personally. I know it's subjective.
That's an awesome reading. And if we're talking about Yoko Kanno, I mean, she's just like
so
a god.
Good.
Like
the range.
That's another thing I've listened to recently is the Macross Plus like movie soundtrack, and there's an extended edition with like, you know, there's
lots of Aphex Twin gestures visually and sonically.
Totally. And I'm not to like, I mean, when you're making films, you're dealing with tropes, you're dealing with generalizations, you're dealing with archetypes, and narrative that obviously will extend to the music, right? And you're playing with fire to some degree, like with like, you know, like it's like, oh, there's a desert, so we have to have someone singing in like, we have to
in Arabic or a flute or an oud or a sitar, which is often wrong.
And one thing I like about, not to generalize about Japanese like filmmaking or composition, but I'm a huge, like, I honestly at this point I listen to, majority of the people I listen to are Japanese composers, and I love a lot of video games and anime and stuff, right? And there's almost this like genuineness to their appropriation that I really like, you know, that like so like, for example, like if we're going back to Cowboy Bebop, that's like, it's like Watanabe, well, the director would be like, okay, like let's take jazz and Wild West sci-fi kind of thing, bounty hunters, and it's kind of like all based on a pretty like shaky foundation of tropes, archetypes, and stereotypes and things like that. I mean, I'm probably misusing the words. You can distill
you're
nonsense
right.
to your. I'm a lower level of education than your students, but like it's but it kind of works because it's like it's everything, right? And it's like they're not trying to be like, oh, this is like genuine Wild West sci-fi American jazz music from the heart. This is like, no, this is a mashup of like shit we find cool. And I mean, obviously, later work of Samurai Champloo, which was honestly one of the things that awakened my, you know, desire to be into production outside of composition, was like just like samurais and underground hip hop and hip hop and stuff like that. And it was just like, it just really, it's just a kooky idea, and it doesn't necessarily have to have that much depth, and it's based upon our expectations of both these things and how they interact with each other, and it works or it doesn't work depending on what you think. But it's kind of like we're in a time where anything kind of goes, and a lot of stuff in Japan was like, especially in the 80s, 90s, early aughts, is like, they'll be like, oh, like here are my formal ideas about how to compose things, but also here is like an experimentation with Celtic music or something, or in jazz in that case. And it's like, because it works on a timbre level or an aesthetic level, and it doesn't scratch too deep, but it doesn't have to, and maybe they don't want to. And it's like, I think there's a genuineness there, whereas like that maybe in a lot of American filmmaking, it's like we're like, no, we mean this, you know, and it has depth.
But
it still doesn't actually. It does not. You know,
which is the irony with that ostensible like seriousness brought to bear, that the final product feels very vapid. And I think you're right. I think there's an anxiety in the West for, and I think in general, and you know, this is a longer conversation when it comes to this idea of intellectual property and rights and violations of the law and the moral substrates that are very much a part and parcel of these kind of discourses when it comes to sampling and remix culture. And then obviously, you know, that distends and metastasizes and spills out into conversations concerning socioeconomic status and access to technology, to instruments, to teaching, et cetera, and so forth. And this idea of a punk aesthetic being a default, a necessity. You know, punk and hip hop, these kind of sort of interesting bedfellows, but you know, the tensions between racial and socioeconomic lines, et cetera. But the ethos being very similar in the sense that, like, what is sincere about your approach to the music is your sincerity about like how it makes you feel. You don't really have to scratch too deep. This is why in my first monograph, I talk a lot about sincerity. The title is Sincerity in Animation, talking about Genndy Tartakovsky, because he's also an individual whose style, his kind of his visual style and aesthetic is at the same time very idiosyncratically precise. You just know a Genndy piece when you see it, by the line, by the weight of the outlines and so on and so forth. But he has this kind of syncretic sensibility. He loves robots. He loves teen drama. He loves samurais. He loves Kurosawa and visual storytelling. He loves David Lean and Lawrence of Arabian, vistas and so on and so forth. But all of that admixture and remixing, which somebody might see as a sort of denigration or cannibalism or something impure, is done so sincerely that it becomes its own thing. I think this is very much the same success that Watanabe gleans. And I'm really curious to see what he does with Lazarus, because from all the sort of promotional material that I've seen so far, it really feels like it almost feels like a sort of inheritor or successor to Bebop, even in the credits. Like, I mean, the same sort of, cutouts, the sort of, primary colors with the silhouettes of the characters and so on. So it'll be interesting to see where he takes it. Some of the sonic properties I've heard from the trailers have this kind of jazz fusion quality as well that harkens back to Bebop. So it'll be interesting to see what he does with the legacy of his own invention, if you will,
Sure.
which dovetails neatly perhaps to the final question I have for you. I wish we could keep talking for longer, but to cap it all out, one of the areas that we didn't really have time to discuss, because as you know, the module is 10 weeks. Functionally, we have 8 teaching weeks where we meet, and then there's 2 weeks off, final project reviews, which is coming up, and reading break. So in that space, there's so much I want to talk about that I can't, hip hop, punk, protest music, and so on. But one of those areas that is also unfortunately neglected is sort of game music, which would make a nice two-hander with sort of, moving images. But the difference being that you participate in this kind of sort of choose your own adventure, playable narrative, which in and of itself is still available and I think sensitive to all the sort of psycho-emotional gestures and tunings and reformulations that music could propel if you're just visually consuming the narrative. So I'm thinking of games like No Man's Sky. I'm thinking of games like Journey, Flow, Shadow of the Colossus being one that like really impacted me when I saw full well that a not small portion of what I felt to be the narrative was sonically described or intimated. So what's your experience with like game music? And I know this could be like an hour in and of itself, but like,
Sure.
What is your experience making it? What's your experience playing game music insofar as the music, and also playing games and the music, etc.? Just
Sure.
your thoughts on
Yeah.
it in general.
Well, I'll start with the more sort of contemporary aspect of me working in games, which is something that I was really curious about for a long time, how it was made in a kind of, I don't want to say non-linear, but there's a, I don't know if I guess you're not talking about games too much in your class, but there is a professor or a journalist, I can't remember, Ian Bogost, who talks a lot about video game stuff.
Yeah.
He used a term called procedural rhetoric, which is basically like as a with a moving image picture, like a animation or film, or you're kind of on this linear path. And with a game, you can choose to walk through the door where you want to go, and there's a procedural rhetoric to like this environment that you're in, and you decide where to go, but it's still within limits. It's a sandbox you're playing in. With music, there's like, that's something that always interested me, like something simple like the phases of a boss or something have different levels of intensity for music. But it's gotten a lot deeper than that now, where obviously you can have the music change and evolve depending on the number of enemies on screen, where you are geographically in the space,
how much life you have left,
how much life you have left. Yeah, like maybe you're building up a meter for like a limit break, or like charging something, and how that would be composed, and I've had a crash course in that over the past couple of years working on a game, and basically it's like you have to think about a composition as like in all of its different states and combinations of states, and as a player you kind of become part of the, like it's not as explicit as a rhythm game where you're playing the music, but it's like,
exactly.
Like you in a game you could choose to remain in one area and linger there, and I have done that in Zelda Breath of the Wild. When you get to like that bird village, the music is just so good. I just was like, bro, I'm just gonna like sit here on the edge of this cliff and just listen to the music. And then after that I was like, I'm just gonna like plug in my Switch and sample directly from the Switch with the sound effects into Ableton, and just make a beat out of this village music, and
like a digital environment, like a whole different ecology. Beautiful.
Yeah, and it's like, because you don't necessarily like, there's just a lot at play, and like that's the one thing that I've loved about working on the music, and also being privy to like what the game developers are doing. And it's like, that's why bug testing exists. Like nobody knows what, once it's done and in the world, what people are going to do with it. And that's what film has like not had, and music in it's just on a CD or on a vinyl has never had that. People want it. They'll remix things. They'll make AMVs of like all the cutscenes from Final Fantasy IX with Linkin Park in the background. And it's like, yes, it's a transcendental experience for me when I'm 16 years old or something. But like
Dragon Ball Z and DMX. Match made happen.
And they actually tried to like, I went to, I mean, I'm like, dude, I'm getting old, because what they were like, they had an exhibit about that at the Vancouver Art Gallery, and it was like, they called it vidding. I'm like, okay, boomers wrote this, but maybe that's just what it's called. I'm like, this is they called it vidding, and it was like editing like TNG edits to like just like music and other things like that, like AMVs, and I'm like, okay, they're trying to formalize it into like, it's so cool that they're trying to like document it. Yeah,
exactly.
It's hard to quantify in some ways, like the nuances of it, unless you were like, you're in it, I guess.
You're in it.
Like to be a curator.
I love that ambiguity. Yeah.
Like if you're a curator that's been dealing with abstract expressionism in the New York School of Painting, and then someone's showing you fucking 480i shot of Dragon Ball Z with like Nickelback playing in the background. It's like, you're like, what is this? This is nothing to me. I'm like, dude, that's a whole generation's freaking it's such a like medium.
it's such a principle and maybe sort of germane formulation of their attempts to do audiovisual stuff. Like they take a scene and they basically rescore it. And they rescore it with so much of that kind of, the only lodestar that they're really following is their own, I won't even say fandom because that feels trite, but the kind of resonance, and again, to use musical language, which has emotional, psycho-emotional consequences, the resonance that they feel watching Gohan go Super Saiyan for the first time. They're like, whoa, something's changed. This is special. And I want to relive that. I mean, I can watch the scene over and over and over again for sure, but I just want to like distill that into sort of the bottled lightning that it was. And I'm the carrying the charge. And to disperse that charge, I like listen to DMX, Flesh of My Flesh. I'm not supposed to at 13, but like it's DMX growling, it's him yelling and whatnot. It's got the sense of triumph, of overcoming, of power. Like, and so you can see that elision. Like to me, for somebody to scoff and denigrate that, to be like, it's so ambiguous, like in the pedagogical space or even in its own right. But what it does is it really conveys a feeling. And I think both, any art form or any medium can carry a charge. And I think music is one of the ones that typically is saddled with, on the one hand, it's saddled with this responsibility. And on the other hand, it's often it's so passively consumed. It's not even interpassive anymore. Like it's just, that interpassivity is kind of split. But anyway, sorry.
Well, to contrast, like, are we done, or can we?
No, go on. Yeah. Please.
Sorry, no. Just contrast the video game versus the film thing is like, just from my perspective, having now worked in it for a while, is like when you're done a movie, like you're working with the creators of the film, and you're saying like, this is what we're doing here for this scene, for this part, for the entirety of the timeline of the film, and we're manipulating in this way, and this is what we're presenting, and we're hoping it sticks. With games, you're kind of just like giving the keys to somebody else. And it honestly felt like I was, because you'll write music in a DAW, digital audio workspace, and then in a movie you'll export it as stems that are designed to be able to be mixed with dialogue and sound effects. And it's usually a grouping that's fairly limited, maybe 5 stems, maybe more, depending on what kind of music you have. And it's designed for technical purposes, those stems. The stems for games can be, at least now, very complicated. And like I remember playing Zelda Twilight Princess for the first time, and if you're in a boss and you're in the periphery of the boss, it's just kind of like timpanis. You're underwater, and you're just, and then as you get closer, the music changes and evolves, and elements of it get louder, like staccato strings will get louder with your proximity to the enemy. And this is something that like now like it's very engaging, because I'm not saying that fighting a boss in Zelda is the same as making a Linkin Park AMV, but like you feel like you're part of the music. And even just the physical practice of exporting from my DAW is, you know, we're going from 5 stems to be like 28 stems, and there is different types of percussion that can crossfade and change, and the lead can change from a combination of like an ensemble of strings, say, playing harmonies, to just one raw guitar playing the same melody without harmony.
Right.
And it can seamlessly transition at a time that I can never predict, and will be different every time for everyone playing it on some level. And
based on the decisions that they make. Yeah.
In real time in the game. And and when I export from the DAW all these different stems, which are the elements of the song, you know, they go into a different software, typically that's either proprietary to the video game company, or there's fairly largely used ones that work well with Unreal Engine and Unity, like Wise is one of them with 2 W's, Fmod is another one. And they kind of look like their own DAW that run in the background of the game. And it's so this is just getting to my own little pet theories here, but like as a player of a game, you're kind of like controlling a DAW through a completely procedural, just completely exercised from music way of creating music. And I think that's why it's so addictive and immersive for so many people, is because like, you know, like you're in this space now and you have complete control over your destiny, and it's aurally and visually reflected in what you do. And it's like, even if it's very stylized and very distilled into a simple
very
thing,
simple, or
it's
barely noticeable,
it's still just intoxicating, right? And it's like it's creative, and it's a unique to you experience. And at that point, I have control over the key, the emotions of elements of the music, the timbre, the instruments, things like that. I have you know, the BPM maybe I have control over. But at some point I hand it over to the devs, and then they hand it over to the players. And as the people who made it, we know less about what can be done with it than ever before. And I think we'll see more of that maybe with VR or immersive experices. God forbid AI, I don't know. But like, it's like, just like, to me, that's like the ultimate thing, is like, it's kind of like, sure, people like to listen to lo-fi music where there's like on YouTube, it's like a snowy village and there's like beats in the background and wind sounds or something. But like, if you're playing video games, like especially retro games too, like, again, retro games are less dynamic and less non-linear really than the contemporary stuff that I'm more talking about. But like, playing retro games and playing games in general is like, you're getting a complete multimedia experience that you have control of. You can just stop in Skyrim and have a beer or an ale or a mead in like, you could play Skyrim on PS4 with the bad VR heavy mask, sit in a bar for like 3 days straight and make your own little immersive performance art experience. And that's like, that recording of that and that experience is like unique to you. I mean, like it's something else. Like, we do live in an interesting time for that. I mean, I don't know, I'm kind of rambling now, but like,
no, that's so interesting to me, because, and maybe unbeknownst to you, we start off, I mean, I start off with quite a gambit in this module, and one of the shapes that gambit takes is talking about string theory.
Right. Yeah.
You have Eric Whitten and all these people in the 90s who were developing ostensible ways to sort of, reconcile general relativity and quantum mechanics, which has been an ongoing project basically since Heisenberg and the Copenhagen School, etc. Why I think that is resonant and relevant to music is because Whitten describes this idea of one-dimensional filaments that are basically the constitutive elements for all matter, as these kind of tiny vibrational strings, and the way in which they interact with one another, the way in which they vibrate, determines sort of the ostensible resonances, the harmonies, the chords, if you will, of a variety of different types of matter coalescing and collapsing into what we can measure. And even these terms are so musical: measure, resonance, oscillation, and so on. The physics of sound in and of itself becoming sort of a vocabulary to describe not only the sonic properties of the sound, but the emotional consequences that they induce in the listener. And one of the most interesting aspects or concepts in quantum mechanics and general relativity and quantum physics more broadly is this idea of superpositions. And so it seems to me like when you describe the sort of iterative nature, or the fact that as a developer of game music, that you have to have these kind of like atomic, like arrangements of a variety of different things that can be triggered in different ways, that have to interrelate with different aspects thereof at different times and different scenarios and different situations, different intensities, this, that, and the other, that the game in and of itself, in its audio properties, represents a kind of superposition of potential music that could be adduced or made, depending on how it is that you collapse that panoply of potential into actuality based on the choices that you make. Much in the same way that if you have a sort of open world game, like you have a sort of a variety of superpositions of possibilities that collapse into the narrative that you basically choose based on the decisions that you make. There's a very sort of quantum quality about it, like a superposition of musical states that the system can take based on the decisions that you make. That's a very, I'm using quantum language to describe it, but it seems to me to resonate in a similar way. And it's interesting to think of, wave oscillations and Hamiltonians and all these things that, like, all these experimental physicists, including Maxwell and Faraday, were thinking about, they think about the propagation of waves, sound waves in particular, to kind of think about the constitutive properties of reality. And when you talk about a virtual reality, that a not small portion of its quantum properties are sonically determined, whether or not you see them that way or not, whether they're noticeable or loud. Snake gets hit by like Revolver Ocelot in the face with a 6-shooter, and then there's a crescendo or decrescendo, whatever. So that's noticeable, but you move from one zone where there's snow to a snow where to a part of Shadow Moses where it's like a steel catwalk, and you're listening to the tick 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 of his boots on the steel. You're hearing the sort of guards talking. You're hearing the wind blowing through the place, but you're also hearing maybe a distant shakuhachi or like a little sort of like tremolo like line on. So all of those things describe this kind of superposition that's responding in real time to the decisions that was collapsing in and around the decisions of the player. It collapses around those choices to kind of become like elements of the gameplay. That would be the sort of quantum take. But like as soon as you said like multiple states, I was like, oh man.
Yeah, I mean, like
string theory.
Yeah. Oh, that just reminds me of string theory. This complicated thing that defines our reality.
I don't know the math, but like I think it's the intuition. I think that's why Witten describes it in this way. He's like, and he's got this fantastic like falsetto voice. He's such an interesting guy. He's just like, I just imagine the tiny strings vibrating together, just like a violin or cello. Yeah, and so we talk about that in conjunction with Tolkien's Silmarillion, because the music of Iluvatar and the Ainur, he basically describes his entire sort of the cosmology of his legendarium as like one great music. C.S. Lewis does the same thing in The Magician's Nephew. Aslan sings a song and trees sprout and stars appear and like animals, and then they start talking to each other and so on. So this idea of music being not just it kind of allows you to intone the ineffable. Like it can like life is a song.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think music is the meaning of life. I always say that, but and animals, taking care of animals. But I think definitely with music, it is just physical events happening, right? Like it's vibrations, modifying air, stimulating things in your eardrum that create a neural pathway with a message to your brain that we derive meaning from. But I do think with visual and audio and how powerful music is for most humans, it's almost like we're trying to extrapolate to something else that we can't understand. And well, I listened to like a podcast recently from The Economist about using AI to decipher animal language, and there's a lot there, sure, but it's like basically it's like all predicated on audio, and we're not really sure that's we know that that's not the full experience. We know that we don't have like we're trying to use our senses, I think, through moving images and audio in a lot of ways to like get closer to something beyond what we can understand maybe, and evoke something that is just trying to breach free of this semiotic kind of bubble we're in.
The anthropic horizon, if you will.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if that's a word that exists, and a term
it is now.
But like, but yeah, like, it's like, what was I gonna say? Shoot. yeah, like just the idea that like maybe smell is an extremely deep and nuanced experience for a dog. They can locate things, they can have identity, they can associate it with identity. Like
it has
I don't
emotional
know,
consequences.
Exactly. And rats and bats and things like that they don't, maybe they bats echolocate, but rats and like smaller rodents and things, they see in UV and like one other color, you know, like
Same
so it's
with
like
snakes, seeing in like in infrared and all this.
So there you go. And we can't understand. We can use technology to try to triangulate what some of that would look or feel or be like and attach our own meaning to it. But ultimately, like certain UV or certain smells or like sound reflecting off of a cave into an ear that is completely different than ours is not something we could ever wrap our head around. Just like listening to like French DJs sampling dusty Brazilian 7-inches probably doesn't have that much meaning to a cat, other than like, this is loud and I'm alarmed. You know, like, and why am I in this house shitting in a box every day, and why do you scoop my poop out of it? But like it's like we're trying something here, and we're driven to do it. We've been driven to do it. It kind of predates most things. Like I'd say like cave drawings and fucking music is like, we've been doing it forever. It's like even before making up religion, we're like, no, let's like, I want to hear your set or whatever. like so like, I mean, like, I don't know. I don't know if I'm ruining your class. Sorry.
No, not at all. Not at all. I think there's, whilst maintaining the anonymity of a lot of students who've taken, as a sort of culminating point, and not small, the way in which the module culminates is with a sort of an extended project. It accounts for 80% of your grade, so it's quite a big deal. That's quite a bit. It's a big piece of work, and a lot of what we've discussed will take a variety of different forms based on the proposals that I've received. So I'm really excited to see how it is that potentially this discussion could offer some nuance, another surface upon which to bounce certain ideas and echo, if you will, a ricochet. And I think you're right. I've always said that music is the most important and maybe the most redeemable aspect of the species as a whole. But I think that is because it allows us this strange Nietzschean idea of sort of in our Apollinian techniques or ability to sort of like formalize things to try and touch like what he calls the Dionysian, the sort of like rumbling intensity of nature and reality itself. Or to put it another way, which I use this phrase in talking about the sort of the strange sonic qualities of David Lynch's Eraserhead. A lot of people ask, like, why does his movie sound like that? What is that weird sort of like roaring cosmic microwave background radiation? Like it's got such a weird, it's not even static. Like it's a weird, like a roar, like a low rumble. And to me, visually, narratively, and sonically, Lynch was always trying to intone the ineffable. That which resists symbolization perhaps can be reached most directly and closely through music. And that's why I think it's special. But on that note, no pun, I really want to just take the time to thank you for being so generous and so, oh man, just covering such a wide range, technically, so many genres, so many different media through which, through which me and my students can kind of think about what we've discussed heretofore in this module. And I'd love to do this again whenever it is that I get to run this module one more time. So I'll thank you for your time. And if there's anything that you, maybe a parting thought for any potential musicians or any potential students who are interested in maybe scoring films or getting into game music, what would you advise? Or even just playing an instrument?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much advice, but my go-to is always just like, try it. Like, don't feel like you need to go to take a class or be taught something by, or spend money in order to be something. Like you making music especially for film and games, I really think is like, just see what works. And if you have something that you like the sound of, see how it looks visually to something, and even just an existing movie, just rescore it for fun. And then the other thing is find music that you want to copy that nobody else has copied. Don't like a pitfall is now I'm just becoming like jaded old music guy, but like a pitfall is like that I find that I did in my early career was like, oh, I like Flying Lotus, I'm going to remake that, but like find what Flying Lotus found in 2005 before he made the Toonami beats, like find that version of that for you, and then dig deeper and deeper and deeper and fail several times. Most things that are reaching you have the person who made it has gone through a lot of failure and a lot of trial and error and thrown a lot at the wall that didn't stick. So don't be discouraged, but find your, dig through your crates, whatever that may be, for years if needed. Anyways,
I think that's I love that. I think that's salient, and I think that's practical, and I certainly appreciate it, and I know the inaugural class of 336 will as well. So I'll just thank you one more time, man. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
My pleasure.